On the 28th of June, 1914, the future of Europe did not announce itself loudly. There were no sirens, no declarations, no sense that the world was about to change. There was only a city going about its mourning, trams rattling along narrow streets, shopkeepers opening their doors, a river moving quietly through a valley surrounded by hills. To most of the people in Sarajevo that morning, this was just another Sunday. And yet, history had been gathering here for a very long time, long before the Archduke arrived, long before the conspirators took their positions, long before a wrong turn would bring a car to a stop beside a bridge. This was a city shaped by empire, by borders drawn and redrawn, by promises made and broken. A place where modern administration sat uneasily atop older loyalties, and where the future felt unresolved. When the first shots were fired, they would echo far beyond the streets where they were heard. But to understand why they mattered, we have to understand where they were fired. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 2. Sarajevo in 1914 was not just another provincial city on the edge of Europe. It was a place where empires overlapped, where identities blurred, and where the future of the Balkans felt unsettled long before a single shot was fired. The city sits in a narrow valley in Bosnia-Herzegovina, surrounded by hills, with the Miljacka River running through its center. For centuries, Sarajevo had been shaped by Ottoman rule. Mosques, bazaars, and winding streets reflected that past. But by the early 20th century, Austro-Hungarian authority had layered itself on top of the old order administrative buildings, military barracks, and wide boulevards meant to signal control and modernization. This coexistence was uneasy. Bosnia-Herzegovina itself was one of the most politically sensitive regions in Europe. Its population included Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, Muslim Bosniaks, and Jewish communities, often living side by side, but pulled in different political directions. Many did not see themselves as belonging to the Austro-Hungarian Empire at all. For Vienna, Bosnia represented stability imposed from above. For Slavic nationalists, it represented occupation. And for Serbia, just across the border to the southeast, Bosnia carried deep symbolic weight. Many Serbian nationalists believed the region should be part of a larger South Slavic state, free from imperial rule and united by shared language and culture. That tension made Sarajevo a dangerous place for symbolism. And symbolism mattered deeply in 1914. The date chosen for the Archduke's visit, June 28, fell on Vidovdan, a Serbian national day commemorating a medieval battle against the Ottoman Empire. Over centuries, that battle had become a symbol of sacrifice, loss, and resistance. To many Serbian nationalists, Vidovdan represented the idea that defeat could still carry meaning, that suffering could serve a larger cause. For Austro-Hungarian officials, the date may have seemed coincidental. For others, it felt provocative. So when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in Sarajevo that morning, he was stepping into a city already heavy with unresolved history. What no one yet understood was how quickly that history was about to assert itself. To understand what happened in Sarajevo, on the 28th of June, 1914, we need to slow the clock down, because this was not a clean plot. It was not inevitable, and it was not the product of flawless execution. It was a chain of near misses, misjudgments, and chance. At the center of the story stands Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was not an obvious symbol of tyranny. He was 49 years old in 1914, the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph, and the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was serious, private, and often described as difficult. He disliked ceremony. He distrusted Hungarian politicians. And he was deeply aware that the empire he would one day inherit was fragile. What made Franz Ferdinand especially controversial was not aggression, but reform. He believed that the empire could survive only if its Slavic populations were given greater autonomy. He supported restructuring Austria-Hungary into a more federal system, one that might blunt nationalist pressures by giving ethnic groups more political voice. Ironically, this made him more dangerous to radical nationalists, not less. If the empire reformed and endured, the case for violent revolution weakened. On the morning of June 28, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo by train. Sophie's presence mattered. Their marriage had been controversial because she was not of royal blood, and public appearances together were rare. This visit was one of the few times they were allowed to appear side by side. The schedule was tight. After a military inspection, the couple boarded an open-top car for a procession through the city toward Sarajevo City Hall. The route followed the Miljacka River, cutting through the heart of the city. Waiting along that route was a small group of conspirators. They were young, poorly resourced, and loosely coordinated. Most were Bosnian Serbs in their late teens or early 20s. They shared nationalist beliefs, but little practical experience. Some had received pistols and bombs through contacts linked to Serbian military intelligence, though the Serbian government itself did not control the operation. Among them was Gavrilo Princip. Princip was 19 years old. He was thin, sickly, and intensely serious. He had grown up poor in rural Bosnia and had become radicalized through nationalist literature and student networks. Like others in young Bosnia, he believed that dramatic action could force history forward, that martyrdom itself carried political meaning. But Princip was not alone. Along the route stood several conspirators, spaced out in case one failed. Each carried a weapon. Each waited for the motorcade to approach. At approximately 10:10 a.m., the Archduke's car came into view. The first conspirator froze. The second hesitated. The third acted. Nedeljko Chabranovic stepped forward and threw a bomb toward the car. It struck the folded roof, bounced off, and landed beneath the following vehicle. The explosion was loud and violent. Shrapnel tore into the car behind the Archduke, injuring several officers and bystanders. But Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were unharmed. The car accelerated away. Chabranovic attempted to swallow cyanide and jump into the river. The poison failed. The river was shallow. He was arrested. At this moment, the plot had failed. The motorcade reached City Hall. Inside, Franz Ferdinand was furious. He interrupted the mayor's prepared speech, shouting that he had just been attacked with bombs. But then, something remarkable happened. He regained his composure. The official program resumed. This decision mattered. After the ceremony, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded officers in the hospital. Security officials advised against it, but he overruled them. The plan changed. The route changed, but the communication did not. The driver of the lead car was not properly informed of the new route. As the motorcade departed, it followed the original path. Near the Latin Bridge, the driver turned onto Franz Joseph Street, realized the mistake, and stopped the car to reverse. And standing only a few feet away was Gavrilo Princip. He had assumed the opportunity was gone. He had wandered toward a nearby cafe, stunned and disappointed. He was not poised for action. And then the car stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Princip stepped forward. He raised his pistol. He fired twice. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other struck Sophie in the abdomen. Witnesses later described confusion, shouting, screams. The Archduke reportedly said, "Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Within minutes, both were dead. It is hard to overstate how close this assassination came to not happening. If the bomb had detonated differently, if the visit had been canceled, if the route had not been changed, if the driver had been informed, if Princip had left moments earlier, history turned not on inevitability, but on coincidence. And yet, once it happened, its meaning expanded rapidly. At first, Europe reacted calmly. Markets did not panic. Diplomats expressed condolences. Many leaders treated the assassination as another Balkan tragedy, serious, but contained. But within Austria-Hungary, interpretation hardened. This was no longer a crime. It was an attack on imperial authority, a test of credibility. If the empire did nothing, nationalist movements everywhere might feel emboldened. And so, what began as an improvised act of violence by a handful of young men became the event through which Europe's deepest fears would finally surface. The shots in Sarajevo echoed far beyond the Latin Bridge. They echoed through alliance systems, military timetables, and assumptions that had been building for decades. The spark had landed, and the system was ready to burn. In the hours after the assassination in Sarajevo, Europe did not react the way we might expect. There were no emergency mobilizations, no frantic diplomatic summits, no sense that a continent-spanning war was about to begin. Instead, there was restraint. In Vienna, the immediate mood was complicated. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne, but he was not widely loved. He was seen as abrasive, difficult, and politically disruptive. Some officials privately viewed his death as tragic, but also inconveniently convenient. The Viennese press reflected this ambivalence. Newspapers reported the assassination prominently, but the tone was measured rather than incendiary. Headlines expressed shock and outrage, but they did not immediately call for war. The event was framed as a crime, not yet as a casus belli. This restraint was partly intentional. Austria-Hungary's leadership wanted time. Time to investigate. Time to prepare. Time to decide how to respond without appearing reckless. And just as importantly, time to shape the narrative. Behind the scenes, diplomats and officials were already at work. Reports flowed from Sarajevo to Vienna. Evidence was gathered linking the assassins to nationalist networks with ties however loose to Serbia. But none of this moved quickly. Across Europe, the assassination was initially interpreted as another Balkan tragedy. Political violence in the region was not unusual. Assassinations had occurred before without triggering general war. Diplomatic cables from the days immediately following June 28 reflect this assumption. Ambassadors expressed condolences, discussed stability, and reassured one another that the situation could be managed. In Berlin, German leaders reacted calmly. Kaiser Wilhelm II reportedly expressed personal outrage, but there was no immediate sense of alarm. The assassination was seen as serious, but not unprecedented. In Paris and London, the response was even more subdued. Governments acknowledged the event, but did not treat it as a turning point. The Balkans were viewed as volatile, but contained dangerous, but distant. So why no panic? Part of the answer lies in experience. Europe had weathered crises before. The Moroccan crises, the Balkan Wars, diplomatic standoffs, each had raised tensions, mobilized rhetoric, and then receded without igniting a general war. These episodes taught leaders the wrong lesson. They came to believe that escalation could always be managed. Another part of the answer lies in timing. The assassination occurred at the start of summer. Many political leaders were on holiday. Parliaments were not in session. Decision-making slowed, not sped up. There was no immediate pressure to act. And then there was the assumption deeply ingrained by 1914 that even if a crisis escalated, there would be time for ultimatums, time for negotiations, time for mobilization without immediate conflict. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. What changed the tone was not the assassination itself, it was how Austria-Hungary chose to interpret it. Within days, the event was reframed. No longer a tragic crime committed by individuals, it became evidence of a systemic threat emanating from Serbia. The question shifted from who pulled the trigger to who stood behind them. And once that question took hold, the assassination ceased to be a local incident. It became a test of credibility. If Austria-Hungary responded weakly, it risked encouraging nationalist movements across its empire. If it responded forcefully, it risked provoking Russia. For the moment, however, that tension remained beneath the surface. Publicly, Europe was calm. Privately, calculations were already beginning to harden. The silence after Sarajevo was not peace. It was a pause. And in that pause, Europe prepared itself slowly, deliberately, for a confrontation it still believed it could control. To understand how the assassination in Sarajevo turned into a continental crisis, we need to shift our focus north, from the Balkans to Berlin. Because whatever Austria-Hungary decided to do next would depend almost entirely on one question. Would Germany stand behind it? In early July 1914, German leaders were not panicked. They were calm, and that calm is precisely what makes their decisions so consequential. Germany in 1914 was led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, a volatile, energetic monarch who loved displays of power and military pageantry. But despite his reputation for impulsiveness, Wilhelm rarely acted alone. Real influence lay with a small circle of military and civilian advisors, men who had spent years thinking about war in abstract, strategic terms. At the center of this circle were figures like Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, the cautious but increasingly pessimistic head of the German government, and the leaders of the German General Staff, whose planning dominated strategic thinking. When news of the assassination reached Berlin, Wilhelm reacted emotionally. He expressed outrage. He condemned Serbian nationalism. He spoke openly of the need to support Austria-Hungary. But outrage alone did not drive policy. What mattered was interpretation. German leaders did not view the assassination primarily as a criminal act. They saw it as confirmation of something they already believed, that Austria-Hungary was under existential threat from Slavic nationalism, and that Russia stood behind it. From Berlin's perspective, the question was not whether a crisis would come, it was when. For years, German military planners had warned that Russia was modernizing rapidly. Its rail network was expanding. Its industrial base was growing. Given enough time, Russia would become a far more formidable military opponent. Delay favored Germany's enemies. This belief shaped everything. By 1914, German leaders increasingly saw war as inevitable. The only variable in their minds was timing. If war had to come, better to fight sooner before Russia's strength fully matured. That logic did not mean Germany wanted war immediately. But it did mean that backing Austria-Hungary decisively felt like a calculated risk rather than reckless aggression. When Austrian officials arrived in Berlin in early July, they presented their case. Serbia, they argued, had become intolerable. Nationalist agitation threatened the empire's survival. If Austria-Hungary failed to act now, it might never be able to reassert control. They asked Germany directly, would it stand by them? The answer came quickly. Germany offered unconditional support. Whatever Austria-Hungary chose to do, Germany would back it diplomatically, politically, and militarily. This assurance would later be called the blank check. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire crisis, but it was not made lightly. Inside Berlin, there were doubts. Bethmann-Hollweg worried about Britain. Germany had no desire to fight Britain, whose navy remained dominant and whose entry would transform any conflict into a global war. Some advisors hoped that a strong Austrian move against Serbia might localize the conflict, frighten Russia into backing down, or at least delay escalation. Others believed that even if war followed, Germany's alliance system and planning would give it the advantage. These arguments were not unanimous, but they shared a dangerous assumption. They believed events could still be controlled. They believed Austria-Hungary could strike decisively. Serbia could be isolated, Russia might hesitate, and Britain might stay out. Each of those beliefs rested on optimistic readings of the situation. And yet, from Berlin's perspective, refusing support felt even riskier. If Germany failed to back Austria-Hungary, it risked losing its only reliable ally. Austria-Hungary's collapse would leave Germany isolated, surrounded by hostile powers. That outcome felt unacceptable. So Germany chose commitment. In doing so, it changed the entire character of the crisis. Before the blank check, Austria-Hungary faced uncertainty. Any action against Serbia carried enormous risk. After the blank check, that uncertainty was gone. Restraint no longer offered safety. Aggression became feasible. This shift mattered enormously. The blank check did not order Austria-Hungary to go to war, but it removed the final barrier that might have prevented it. It turned a regional dispute into a confrontation between alliance systems. It narrowed options, hardened positions, and made compromise less attractive. What makes this moment so tragic is that German leaders did not believe they were choosing catastrophe. They believed they were managing inevitability. They believed delay was dangerous. They believed firmness would prevent wider war, or at least ensure Germany fought under favorable conditions. They were wrong, but they were not irrational. And that distinction matters. Because the blank check was not a failure of emotion, it was a failure of imagination. German leaders could imagine war. They could imagine mobilization. They could imagine victory. What they could not imagine was a world transformed beyond recognition by 4 years of industrialized slaughter. And once the blank check was given, the crisis moved out of the realm of possibility and into momentum. By mid-July 1914, the center of gravity in Europe had shifted. The assassination was no longer the question. The question was how Austria-Hungary would respond and how far the rest of Europe would allow that response to go. Inside Vienna, debate narrowed quickly. There were voices urging caution warnings about Russia, about escalation, about the dangers of acting alone. But those voices were steadily drowned out by a growing consensus that something decisive had to be done. Austria-Hungary's leaders believed they were running out of time. Serbia, in their view, was not merely a hostile neighbor. It was a symbol, a magnet for Slavic nationalism that threatened to tear the empire apart from within. If Serbia could sponsor or tolerate violence against imperial officials without consequence, then Austria-Hungary's authority would be exposed as hollow. And hollow authority in a multinational empire was fatal. So Vienna moved toward an ultimatum, but not just any ultimatum. This one was designed to do 2 things at once. First, it would force Serbia into submission publicly and unmistakably. Second, if Serbia refused, it would justify war in the eyes of Europe. The wording mattered. The demands had to be severe enough that rejection was likely, but framed carefully enough that Austria-Hungary could claim it had exhausted diplomacy. On the 23rd of July 1914, the ultimatum was delivered to the Serbian government in Belgrade. Serbia was given 48 hours to respond. The demands were sweeping. Serbia was required to suppress nationalist organizations hostile to Austria-Hungary. It was required to arrest specific individuals named by Vienna. It was required to accept Austro-Hungarian participation in internal investigations, a direct violation of Serbian sovereignty. These terms went far beyond normal diplomatic pressure. They were meant to humiliate. Across Europe, reactions were immediate. In Paris and London, diplomats recognized the ultimatum for what it was, an attempt to force a crisis. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey warned that the terms were the harshest he had ever seen, delivered to one sovereign state by another in peacetime. Russia reacted with alarm. St. Petersburg viewed the ultimatum not simply as pressure on Serbia, but as a test of Russian credibility. If Russia failed to support Serbia now, it risked losing influence across the Balkans and beyond. And yet, even at this moment, war was not inevitable. Serbia still had a choice. The Serbian government faced an impossible dilemma: reject the ultimatum outright and risk immediate war, or accept it and sacrifice independence. In the end, Serbia chose a third path. On July 25, just hours before the deadline expired, Serbia delivered its response. The reply stunned observers. Serbia accepted nearly every demand. It agreed to suppress nationalist groups. It agreed to arrest named individuals. It pledged cooperation with Austria-Hungary in almost all areas. The only demands it rejected were those that allowed foreign officials to operate freely within Serbian territory, a line that would have effectively reduced Serbia to a protectorate. From a diplomatic standpoint, this was extraordinary. Many European leaders believed the response should have diffused the crisis. It did not. In Vienna, the decision had already been made. The Serbian reply was dismissed as insufficient. On the 28th of July 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Artillery began shelling Belgrade almost immediately. At this point, the crisis entered a new phase. Once the first shots were fired, alliance obligations and military planning took over. Russia now faced its own dilemma. Failing to act would signal weakness, not just to Austria-Hungary, but to Germany and to Slavic populations throughout Eastern Europe. Acting risked a wider war. Russia chose partial mobilization. This was meant as a signal pressure without commitment. But in Berlin, partial mobilization was viewed as a myth. German military planners believed mobilization could not be reversed. Once Russia began moving troops, Germany felt it had to respond. On July 31, Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia, demanding that mobilization cease. Russia did not comply. Germany then issued an ultimatum to France, asking whether it would remain neutral in a war between Germany and Russia. France did not answer. The silence was answer enough. Mobilization followed. Military timetables now dictated events. Trains began moving. Orders were issued. Communications accelerated. Political leaders felt increasingly powerless. Many later claimed that events had slipped beyond their control. That is only partly true. No law of nature forced these decisions. But each government believed that stopping now would be more dangerous than continuing. Britain remained undecided. Its treaty obligations were less explicit. Its cabinet was divided. Many leaders hoped to remain neutral. That hesitation would not last. Germany's war plan required a rapid strike against France through Belgium, a small, neutral country whose independence Britain had long guaranteed. On August 2, German forces demanded passage through Belgian territory. Belgium refused. On August 4, Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war. By early August 1914, Europe was fully engulfed. What had begun as an assassination in Sarajevo had become a global conflict, not because leaders wanted total war, but because each decision narrowed the path back to peace. The July crisis is often described as a failure of diplomacy. That is true, but incomplete. It was also a failure of imagination. Leaders imagined limited wars, controlled escalations, manageable risks. They did not imagine a war that would last 4 years, consume entire societies, and leave millions dead. By the time they realized what they had unleashed, it was far too late to stop it. By the end of July 1914, Europe had crossed a line it did not fully recognize. What began as a single act of violence in Sarajevo became a test of authority, then a test of credibility, and finally, a test of will. At every stage, leaders believed they were choosing the least dangerous option available to them. Austria-Hungary believed it had to act or risk internal collapse. Germany believed delay would only strengthen its enemies. Russia believed it could not abandon Serbia without sacrificing influence and prestige. France believed neutrality meant isolation. Britain believed it still had time to decide. Each belief made sense on its own. Together they made restraint impossible. The July crisis did not unfold in chaos. It unfolded through procedure. Ultimatums were issued. Deadlines expired. Mobilization schedules were activated. Decisions were framed as technical necessities rather than political choices. By the time Europe realized it was moving toward war, it was already moving too fast to stop. The tragedy of the July crisis lies not in a single reckless decision, but in the accumulation of reasonable ones, each narrowing the path back to peace. And when the fighting finally began, it did so under assumptions that would prove disastrously wrong. Because in the summer of 1914, nearly everyone believed the war would be short. They believed modern states were too interconnected for prolonged conflict. They believed decisive battles would resolve the war quickly. They believed enthusiasm, discipline, and planning would carry them through. They were wrong. In the next episode, we'll follow the opening weeks of the war itself. We'll watch Germany move through Belgium under the assumptions of the Schlieffen Plan. We'll see Britain make the final decision to enter the war, and we'll follow the first major clashes on the Western Front as long-held illusions begin to collapse. August 1914 would not bring the swift resolution so many expected. Instead, it would reveal what industrial war actually looked like and why there would be no easy way out. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.